Having seen a lot of discussion around Tekken, combined with a recent event where a completely legitimate player was accused of cheating, I've come to the conclusion that we don't really have enough comprehensive resources to explain the tools and tech used at a high level. What does it mean when people say Tekken's a defensive game? Why can this guy block all my lows? How do I stop eating 50-50s for breakfast? I'll be going through some advanced defensive concepts that high-level players use to cover multiple offensive options and simplify the situations they're in. This information is definitely not new, but it's also, to my knowledge, not comprehensively gathered somewhere. I hope this helps you better understand what people talk about, but also what you're actually watching when you're looking at high-level Tekken matches. At its core, advanced defense in Tekken is enabled by a few things. One, you can cancel any movement into any other kind of movement, and you're almost never required to commit to something like a dash or a sidestep. Another important thing is that you can block all backdashing. This means you can safely create space without putting yourself in danger, and is at a basic level what you should be doing almost all the time. If you think my voice is annoying and don't want to watch this video, or if everything from here on out is too complicated, the one thing you can take out of it is, if someone's attacking into you and you're just holding back, you're doing it wrong. The first method of advanced defense is what's called the back guard, and oh boy, I'm sure there's many less clunky names for it. It's meant to take advantage of how different types of moves have different startup speeds. A character's most useful pokes, their fast jabs, down forward ones, etc. tend to be fast highs and mids. If they want to mix you up with a low, that low is generally going to come out a lot slower than those pokes. So for defensive option number 1, backdash is normal, but you press down back at the timing where a low would hit. This achieves two things. 1, you're creating distance and you're creating potential for your opponent to whiff their moves. 2, you're automatically defending against both their fast mid attacks and their slow low attacks. You might also have already realized that what I'm talking about is very similar to the Korean backdash, and that's because it is exactly a Korean backdash. The strength of a KBD isn't just a fast backwards movement, it's also a very potent defensive tool. You can time your KBD inputs and hold down for slightly longer than usual to implement this type of card, while being extremely evasive. Even if you're not good at KBD, just doing back down back is extremely effective. The other big form of defense is sidestep guard. As you can imagine, it involves sidestepping and then guarding at a particular timing. This takes advantage of similar principles as back down back guard, but now more focused around move tracking. Fast pokes or power moves tend to be very linear, meaning not only can you avoid them with sidestepping, but also that you clear their hit area before they can actually hit you. In contrast, tracking or homing moves will generally take longer to connect with you, so you can sidestep and then time your guard to avoid common pokes, but block moves meant to call out your movement. Using Kazumi as an example, her down forward 1 is 13 frames and her back 2 is 15 frames. By the frame data alone, you might think that sidestep blocking here would be an unreasonably tight 2-frame window, but you end up clearing the space that down forward 1 will hit a few frames before it actually does, giving you a much bigger window than it seems. In Kazumi's case, it's still kind of a tight timing, and some characters have even faster tracking or homing moves than her. You generally want to err on the side of being too careful and doing too short of a sidestep rather than getting hit. I bet you already have a few very common and simple situations in mind where these guard methods won't work against your average opponent, so let's talk about them. Since these are both methods of fuzzy guarding, if your opponent uses options that are similar in timing but cover different things, they won't be nearly as effective. Fuzzy guarding here, but also in any other fighting game, is basically the layer 1, something that simplifies a lot of interactions, but also something that your opponent can specifically target to be a threat to you. For instance, if you're playing at an intermediate level, a lot of your opponents will most likely use slow power moves and pressure to begin their offense. Those tend to come out at timings similar to most lows, making back down guard ineffective. A lot of characters also have faster lows that trade damage and momentum for being very impractical to fuzzy guard against. A lot of lows track really well to both sides too. How you deal with each of these depends on your playstyle and your opponent. You can use sidestepping or fast counter hits even while minus to discourage use of slow moves altogether. You can opt to just take the faster lows as negligible chip damage, or call them out if your opponent over-relies on them. In the end, it's very important to recognize and adapt to the timings at which your opponents hit connect, and tailor your own timings and habits to beat theirs. It's also important to understand that this isn't meant to defend against everything, it's just meant to defend against multiple things at the same time, and those will be even different per character. Against more experienced opponents, you'll come up against some more advanced techniques for dealing with these types of guards, which are also based on movement. The idea is, instead of changing timings by changing the moves you do, you can change your timings by adding movement to your pokes. dashing forward or sidestepping are really good non-committal ways to fix the weaknesses of your best moves, because any kind of movement will cause your character to realign with the opponent, effectively nullifying their movement. A down forward one by itself would either whiff or be blocked if done at its natural timing, i.e. as early as possible after an interaction, but a dash into a down forward one can cover your opponent's movement and their fuzzy guard timing at the same time. Now this technique does effectively delay your moves in exchange for adding tracking, but A, you can't be counter-hit the same way as when you do a slower move, and B, you don't have to press a button at all. Dash blocking against an offensive opponent is a really effective way to both deny them space and bait panic keep-away moves. While your opponent is backdashing themselves into a wall, you can stay in their face very safely and put them in a bad situation really quickly. Oh, I guess there's one more thing. One hidden, legendary superstar move that covers all forms of movement or fuzzy guard for you for the low price of -13. So Tekken Slayer 1 can be somewhat complicated when you factor in all the characters and the massive variety in move speeds and properties, but I think it's more than worth it to try and implement these principles into your game plan. Even if you're not planning on playing a defensively oriented game, practicing fuzzy guarding for situations where you feel like you're forced to guard will help a lot. Personally, I think you really start understanding Tekken when you start thinking of interactions as less about buttons and more about movement. Movement Tekken beats buttons Tekken. When you base your interactions too rigidly on frame data, attack as early as you can after a hit gets blocked, focus too much on slow moves, etc., you're leaving yourself open to be countered by more movement-centered playstyles. Tekken is a game that defies the traditional I am plus, so it's my turn structure of fighting games, and a lot of situations are more complicated than they might originally seem. When you start finding answers to questions like, why would I ever sidestep when I'm +3? And you start thinking about how to use your opponent's aggression against them, that's when you start understanding movement Tekken. Anytime your down forward one gets blocked and you think, oh, I'm negative, I should just hold back, you're giving up an opportunity to take advantage of your opponent's aggressive habits. Conversely, if you're thinking, oh, they won't attack back, I should just immediately press something to continue my offense, you're opening yourself up with a lot more risk than you might think. So, to go back to defense for a little bit, the fuzzy guarding methods I discussed are really good at giving you openings to attack, but it's important to know how to safely take advantage of them. A lot of players use sidestepping with the intent to press down forward 2 a few frames later, regardless of the situation. And that's basically the easiest way to get yourself punished and then complain that movement doesn't work. When you attack, your hurt boxes generally get wider for the startup of your move. Even if you sidestep for enough frames to clear the hitbox of a linear move, you could press a button and undo that within a couple of frames. So, sidestep, visually confirm if and what you sidestepped, then prefer using something fast like a jab string that doesn't leave you too vulnerable, unless you've identified a slow enough move that you can launch. In general, if you don't have some kind of read, it's more advantageous in the long term to play it a bit safer and not open yourself up to bad situations. Speaking of safety, it will be anything but safe to implement this in your game plan at first, especially online. Not only are the timings slightly different after every interaction, but online Tekken also has a variable amount of input lag that will definitely make things a lot harder, so don't get discouraged, it will take some time. To wrap everything up, honestly the worst thing you can do in Tekken is be predictable. Even defensively, you need to vary your options to prevent your opponent from finding an easy way to cover your habits. Individually, each method of using movement to attack or defend is strong, but has very definite weaknesses that can be taken advantage of. By mixing your options, you can use the threat of one to cover the other. If you deem that in a certain matchup, back down back gives you way better risk for reward and you rarely sidestep, your opponent never has to think about covering that option and using homing moves that put them at a disadvantage when blocked. If you want to sidestep all day, your opponent will never have to think about using linear longer range moves to cover the mid-range without whiffing. You have to make your opponent feel under constant threat of your options, and you want to make them constantly have to think about what they need to cover next. To give my favorite quote to ever have come out of a Tekken video, give them your heart and give them hell.